on the top floor of the penthouse. He's no, that's his virtual background today.
Oh.
I need to step it up a bit, don't I?
Yeah, you're gonna have to find these Zoom virtual backgrounds.
Yeah,
yes, absolutely.
yeah.
Oh gosh, I think I'm looking rather dull and boring too then. Oh.
No.
No, not at all, not at all. Okay, well, let's kick it off. Welcome everyone today to our Coach in Your Pocket Estate and Succession Mastery session. And once again, Juanita, hi, how are you going?
Hi, Mark. Very well, thank you.
That's the way. And welcome Sue from New Zealand, who's joined us as well on the Zoom call. So hi, Sue.
Hi.
Now, I'll just kick off, Juanita, and say the first week we talked about the whole concept of having an estate vision. In other words, not just the technical aspects, but also what comes out of the heart and so on. The second session we did, which is on the Facebook site, is the 4 big issues that people face. We talked about that last time. And today we're going to talk about what we call the due diligence report. And we can go into a little bit more detail on that in a moment. But basically, to me, due diligence is all about discovering the unknowns in regard to the specific currency and appropriateness of existing documentation, tax implications, legal issues, relevance of documentation and structures, and making sure documentation isn't delinquent and out of date and so on. And the goal from this is to provide in reality, an audit of all current structures, documents, asset ownership, and so on. Plus, I know what you guys do, Anita, is provide a report to provide option to fix things that are out of shape. So the transformation is, I guess, from a position of thinking everything's okay to then being in a comfortable position where you've had it audited from someone outside, dangers have been highlighted, and options to improve have been explained. And why it matters is that providing a solution without understanding accurately the underlying base is always going to provide a flawed result. So I guess I would say there, if you build a building on a bad foundation, you're never going to get a good result. So
yeah,
so over to you, Juanita.
Perfect analogy. I think the first 2 weeks we've spoken a lot, as you said, about the wishes, like what your wishes are, and putting it in your own terms what you want. This is where we get down the nitty gritty, and this is where the advisors come in and really earn their worth, because a lot of misconceptions can happen with estate planning, and you're not expected to know all of this, but I think that analogy, Mark, is perfect, making sure the groundwork is right and then building the wishes on top of that.
Absolutely. If people go in and get their estate planning done and for example, they're unsure of the structures that they're involved in, they don't understand the different tax implications and so on, well, it's always going to be an issue. So what I've done, and I can put this up in a second, but it's not working very well with my virtual background, but I've created the 9-step process effectively in regard to the due diligence report. And to put this into context, in our process, it's really step 3 of what we do with people that we work with. In other words, first stages, we have tea and scones effectively. In other words, we just sit down, meet people, have a conversation, make sure we're on the same page and can work together and so on. Then we go through and we create the checklist, the burning issues, and make sure that all the things that we need to cover off for the family are listed, documented, so we can then work through like a strategic projects list. But this is the third part of our process in the due diligence report, and it's what we outsource to the smart people. Juanita, that's you guys.
Is that where well, hopefully that's where I come in. But I think there's a real misconception that you can leave everything in your will and everything just bundles in your will. But not unfortunately, but that's just not the case. And a lot of people aren't aware of that. So this is a very important step to make sure that all of your wealth gets addressed correctly, and see that it goes to the right person. And very important, and it's a very common misconception. So that's why this step is so crucial.
I'm just going to share the screen, if I might, just for a second. I want to show the sort of notes that I guess we've created in regard to what we're talking about here. So when, for example, when we hand this over, Juanita, to yourself, to and your team to get this done, what I like to turn up with first is a bit of a mud map, a bit of a diagram in regard to, not necessarily in depth in regard to the structures and so on, but you at least have a starting point in regard to what's owned, what's owed, what companies there are, trusts and so on in general terms. And then you with an authority then speak to accountants and so on, can come back with the first thing we do is look at an entity diagram. And why is that important to you?
Well, it's the perfect starting point. So right away we get a feel for the family and the different relationships, the different generations, as well as the entities that are related to those individuals. And straight away from that diagram, we can see things that we'll need to address or pick up as we go through the due diligence checklist. And Mark, you'll always give this to us when before we meet with a client. And so we have a bit of background and a bit of a feel before we talk to a new client. And often with complex business structures, we'll get this also and further detail from the person's accountant, because the client's not expected to know all the minute detail of their structures, and often don't. So this is where it's really handy to work in well with the client's accountant or financial planner, and it just is a really nice starting point, which leads down to the rest of the checklist.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. There's kind of two parts to the relationship with the clients. There's two things I do in the first meeting. One is draw a family tree. So we have a full understanding, mum and dad, if there's grandparents still around and so on, who they are, the children's relationships, grandchildren and so on. And normally from that, we can see where the dangers are from a personal point of view in regard to what happens if relationships break down and so on, if there's marriage breakups, bankruptcy and all those sorts of things through the layer of the children. And so I guess that's it from my side. That helps me a lot. But from your side, yeah, you need a base understanding of what the structures are and so on. So I just thought I might let you, you can see that on the screen, okay?
Yeah,
Juanita, can you?
Sure can.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just if you want to go through and just talk about each of those things and why they're important to you.
Yeah, sure. So if we move down to the summary of insurance, and particularly what we're looking at here is life insurance. And when we are doing the due diligence, we'll have a look, if available, at a life insurance policy, if there is one in place. And we're particularly looking at what type of cover there is, but most importantly, who the owner of the policy is and if there's a beneficiary in place. So if there's an individual nominated or if the estate is nominated on that person's death. And that's really important to identify where the wealth will flow through, and we can work on creating or using structures to take advantage of those structures by where the insurance goes through. So all we're asking for here is a copy of the insurance policy. So then we'll read through and we'll look out for those particular things that we're looking for to make sure we put the right structures in place.
I'm just going to speak on a practical point of view here, and it's why I put that first on the list as the summary of insurance, because I have this friend, and this friend got divorced, and he had this $2 million life insurance policy, and life sort of went on, and 5 years later, for some reason, he checked with the insurance company, and he was just going through, making sure that the policy beneficiaries were his two children. And he found out that the actual beneficiary on the policy was still his ex-wife from 5 years ago. So it's very important, that's why I put it there first. That would have been a tragedy. So it's very important. And this is the reason, you guys do this due diligence, is to make sure the ownerships are right from a tax point of view, that the right money is going to go to the right people and so on, and that where you want the money to go is what's actually nominated. So.
Yeah, that's right. And there's often small print. Only recently we picked up some small print in a insurance policy, which address the beneficiary requirements. So it's really important that that small print is checked and picked up.
Yep, absolutely. Have you ever found issues in regard to superannuation when you
Yes.
go through and dig into that?
Yes.
I'm sure you have some good stories on this one.
Isn't this an interesting one? So this is, I find this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions that people have, in that superannuation does not automatically get left in your will, basically to your estate in your will. It's a separate creature as such. So it's very important for us to have a look at the superannuation documents. And of course, we can have two different types. We can have a self-managed super fund, or we can have a retail fund. But in layman's terms, you have the ability to fill out a form and nominate who you would like to be the beneficiary of your superannuation. There are certain classes that are the only eligible recipients, so you can't leave it to your siblings or your next door neighbour. It has to be a spouse, child, or dependent. But that separate piece of paperwork must be completed. And I'll add to that, you can send it to your estate, to your legal personal representative. If you don't have that piece of paper, what happens? Well, basically the trustee of your super fund has a discretion of where that super goes. That can be very problematic, and it can cause huge issues if it doesn't end up where you want it to go. So this is a really, really important piece of the estate planning puzzle.
Absolutely. And if I can just cut in, a good example here would be some of the retail funds, like some of the union funds and so on in Australia. If you didn't have a nomination of beneficiary form, the trustees go off and look at spouses, ex-spouses, children of all different ages and so on, and they kind of make this arbitrary decision, don't they, in regard to how those funds are distributed, which could be totally against your wishes, a bit like the story I was telling about the insurance.
It could be,
end up
that's
going
right.
to somebody that you are no longer in a relationship with, for example, as has happened.
Yeah, and if it also is quite can be quite full of issues in a blended family situation if it's not addressed correctly. So you might wish your super, for example, to go to a spouse or go directly to children. But if you don't nominate that, there could end up being disputes over where that super goes or ends up, and the wrong person might have the control. So without getting too complicated, that it's just really important that we look at what super's in place and who is nominated, and that the nomination is best suited to your structure and your family and your situation. Another key thing here is looking at the components of the superannuation. So there is a taxable and non-taxable component. And by looking at that, it's important for us to be able to evaluate and also recommend what might be the most appropriate way to leave your super from that tax perspective.
Absolutely, and as you say, once again, it's one of those things. I refer to them as delinquent documents. In other words, documents that you might have signed 2 years ago that you've never bothered to get updated. And certainly in regard to as your life changes and your beneficiary wants will change, that's a very important part of the whole process too. And it's, I mean, that in itself sometimes can be worth the whole cost of going through this process, is just making sure that, and we're only in step 2 of the diagram here, but you know, this could save you tens of hundreds of thousands of dollars if you it could have cost you that if you didn't get it right. So it's a very important part, and for most people, they kind of just let this go year by year. So this is a great process to go through.
You'll also see there in the checklist that often life insurance will be held within superannuation. So that ties back into our first step, and we'd all, you know, we'd be looking at that in conjunction. Another fun fact, Mark, about superannuation documents, because, you know, they're lots of fun. With the retail funds, those nominations will often lapse every 3 years, or in fact will.
That's right.
So it is so easy to have that form filled out, and then you may not get a reminder from your retail fund, or you may get a reminder and, if you're like me, put it in the to-do list. But if that lapses after 3 years, you basically have no nomination in place. And then we go back to those issues that we've identified could happen. So really important to make sure those nominations are up to date.
Okay, we'll go into the trust documents, but I guess what this is showing is that it's understanding that what we're doing is, what you guys are doing is actually making sure you get copies of all this correspondence, all this documentation, to make sure it's still accurate, relevant, and current, so that not only are you just looking to evaluate what they own and what they owe, but you're coming up as you go through this report, aren't you, Anita, with recommended courses of action that they'd need to take to be in the best position. Doesn't mean everyone has to take all your recommendations, but at least you're putting up there in front of people, hey, you know, here's a problem. If you need to fix it, you need to do this, and at least then people are aware and informed.
Yeah, that's right, and that's part of the due diligence report that comes out at the end of this to identify any potential risks or decisions that need to be made and make sure they're addressed. And, you know, it may be that the documents in the end up being quite simple and quite straightforward, but the thought process and the due diligence that goes into those documents is the most important thing.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, family trust documents, once again, is certainly for us, whatever's owned in a trust actually doesn't pass through the will. So there's another misconception. People sort of think it's part of their whole estate, but it's not so. And also trust deeds can be out of date and so on. So
yes,
fire away.
Another fun one. So an asset that is owned by a family trust cannot be left in your will because you don't actually own it, the trust owns it. You may control the trust, but you don't own the asset. So what we do here is ask for a copy of the trust deed and any variations, and also the balance sheet. And the reason that's important too is to see, well, obviously what assets and liabilities the trust may own, but also if there's any unpaid present entitlements. So amounts that are owed in the balance sheet to various family members or owed by those family members, because they will become relevant in the administration of the estate. But what we're also primarily looking at here is who controls the trust. So if that's you, who do you want to control it after your death? Because they will be the ones that control those assets. So even though you can't leave these assets in your will because your trust owns it, you can direct who you would want to control them after your death. So a little bit of a different way of dealing with those assets, but that's really important because you might want to nominate who in the next generation you want to control the trust, or if they need assistance. So basically a review of those documents. Noting also a lot of people have a corporate trustee, so a company that is the trustee, and so in that case we'd be looking at who owns the shares. So if you own the shares,
where those shares are going to go. Yep.
Exactly. So if you've left all your assets to your spouse or to your children, part of that would be those shares in that trustee, which may or may not be what you want. So just ticking off those things and making sure that they're addressed as part of the estate planning.
Yeah, and you raise a good point there, because if all the shares in the controlling company are owned, end up in with your spouse, and then that your spouse remarries someone else and they've got 5 kids, you know, there's always the risk of not protecting your own children, which was your original intention. And if you made the decision to leave shares in that company to one of your children, well, then you've got to make sure if they have a falling out with mum, if something goes wrong, that she's still going to be okay as well. So really need to put some thought into who's going to control the trust on an ongoing basis. But I mean, that rolls in perfectly too. It's the same with your company documents and so on as well, partnership documents and property and so on, isn't it?
Yeah.
In regard to understanding each of those.
That's right. And again, similarly to the trust with the company, you know, you might not own the assets, the company will own the assets. But what is important here is the controlling shares. So we'd review the company balance sheet for assets and liabilities. Who are the directors of the company? So as well as dealing with the shares, you might put some thought into if you're a current director, do you need mum and dad to be directors? Maybe only one is advisable. So looking at the structure of the company, making sure it's tied in, and also reviewing the constitution, because not every deed or not every constitution is the same. So lovely bit of bedtime reading, constitutions and trust deeds for us.
Not for me, for you.
Not for you. No, that's okay. And partnership deeds also, because another fun fact, I'm full of fun facts today, Mark. Without addressing the fact in your will or in a partnership deed, a partnership will dissolve upon the death of a partner. So that might not be an ideal situation for people that have their businesses, for example, in partnership. So again, reading through those documents and just checking off that everything flows.
Sure. And look, I'm going to call on Sue, who's I know is on the call from New Zealand, and even though some of the tax laws, Sue, are different in your country, you can see the value in going through this due diligence report, regardless of the differences in our structures, because and normally we recommend that someone separate to the people who set all these documents up as the one that does this due diligence. So, you know, if you've got your usual accountant and your solicitor and so on, we'd get someone separate to that. It's like a second opinion on your situation. So you know, whether it's Australia, New Zealand, whatever the structures are, it's the same concept in regard to going through, making sure the foundation of all the structures that you've got is still set up in the most relevant and appropriate way, to make sure that what your heart's saying, what your intentions are for those that are left behind, is what's going to happen moving forward.
I think a lot of people here, Mark, you know, a lot of people might say, oh, I don't have a trust, I don't have a company, I don't have a partnership, but just about everyone has superannuation, and majority of people have life insurance. So, you know, although not every single dot point here applies to every single person, you can see that the majority do, and you probably haven't thought about it.
Sure. And I mean, one of the other things I know we pick up a lot on when we do these due diligence with clients is looking at the way you currently own things and saying, well, is that, you know, so you might own things in joint names. So you might have, and we've come across people that have got estates worth millions and millions of dollars, and the assets are just owned by mum and dad in their own names, or in joint tenancy, or something like that, which you know, potentially from a tax point of view, from an asset protection point of view, from a succession point of view, and so on, is probably just the worst way to have set up what they've got. And so, you know, that's part of the report that I know you do, Anita, is say to people, well, okay, look, even though you don't have any companies, you don't have any trusts, you don't have any superannuation, whatever you may not have, you know, one of the things I love that you guys do is that you actually look at it all and give advice in regard to, and in conjunction with their accountants before obviously anything's done, is to say, hey, look, maybe you need to set this up in a trust structure. You know, maybe you need to put your, you know, your grazing properties in one structure, your stock in another structure if you're in a rural environment, and something, so you can split the real estate as opposed to the stock, and that just makes things so much simpler in Australia and New Zealand. So when it comes to family succession and so on as well. So it's not just looking at what you've got in the due diligence report. It gives you guys the opportunity to come back and say, hey, you know what, based on our understanding of you know, tax law, the legal side, and so on, you guys might be better protected if you did this. You know, and that, I think, is a very important part of the report as well.
Especially when an individual or family might have their own business, which might entail some risk from a workplace health and safety perspective or a financial perspective. So it's important to look at who owns what. Mark, something you mentioned just then, which I thought would be useful in just highlighting, is joint bank accounts. So a lot of people don't realise that if you have a joint bank account, on your death, the other person will become the owner as such of that bank account, and it's not left to your estate or left via your will. So important if you, for example, wanted to leave the contents of a balance of a bank account to a child, but you own that bank account with your spouse or partner. Well, that's just not possible. So very important to realize that joint bank accounts, and we'll come to property shortly, which is similar, don't form part of your estate that's left in your will.
Absolutely. I've just, sorry, Sue, I hadn't seen this question from you until this very second. Sue's just asked, do you know if the same applies to New Zealand in regard to superannuation, if there's beneficiaries and beneficiary forms and so on in regard to superannuation in New Zealand?
No, I don't. No, I do not.
I'm going to say I don't know either.
But we'll find out for you. We will find out for you.
Watch this space. We'll find out and get back to you on that. Sorry, when I was sharing my screen, I didn't see the chat box, so I'm sorry I didn't answer that earlier for you. Not that we could answer it. Now, the other things, just finishing off, going down the list, is you know, the way you own property and so on. We've kind of talked about, but also loan agreements. And many times, you know, families make a loan to one of the kids or two of the kids or whatever, same amounts, differing amounts. But it's very important, isn't it, to make sure that there's documentation of those sorts of loans, so that at the end of the day, if when mum and dad aren't around, that it's very structured in regard to you know, how each of those children need to square up those loans as part of the estate process.
I've definitely seen, after the death of a parent or parents, siblings squabble about, well, mum lent that person some money and she owes the estate, or similar situations. And when you ask, is there any documentary evidence? No, but they said. And so that's really problematic, and it's not ideal. Yeah. So we would always
need to document it.
Absolutely need to document it, and it can be on friendly terms. It doesn't mean that it's you know, a very onerous formal loan, but it should be documented, just so your intentions are documented. And likewise, in your will, we can address whether you want loans repaid or whether you want them forgiven on your death. So I guess number one, document them. Number two, and again, it goes back to express your wishes, and we can address that in your estate planning.
Absolutely, because look, kids fall apart over $500. You know, mum lent you $500. Where's my $500? So it's not the amount of the loan; it's just making sure that you note it somewhere, you write it down, you leave it with your accountant, solicitor, facilitator like me, or whatever. It's just important to make sure, and that's not just with family members. I mean, it can be outside family members. It can be friends down the street or whatever. Just make sure you've documented and in brief speak the terms of the loan,
and
whether there's interest or not.
That's right, and it also allows you the ability, should you wish to obtain some security over that loan, not because you have any concern about your child, for example, but there's always the potential that child may have a relationship breakdown, or may, if they're in business, enter into financial difficulty, or may down the track have financial problems themselves. So there's another reason why it's important to document that loan and potentially put some security in place, so you can recoup or reclaw those funds back if the child that's borrowing money, for example, we're using that example, a child runs into some difficulty down the track and the money's just not fallen into the other.
To the in-laws, to the outlaws. to the outlaws. No, but I mean, that's what can happen. You can lend, you know, you could lend a daughter, you know, $100,000, and her marriage breaks up. And if there's no documentation of it or any agreement to repay it or whatever, then, you know, how do you account for that back to the family? You may not be able to. So,
no, that's right. Another example is trustee of bankruptcy, if there's bankruptcy problems. So.
Sure. But look, that's I just wanted to touch today. I thought it was a good topic, Juanita, as I know you did, to talk about the real value in doing a due diligence report. To me, it really is about the whole foundation. If you haven't got your structures right, it's kind of pointless doing all the rest of the estate planning, because you're making wishes and wants and directions on things that may not actually be owned by you or able to be assigned by you, or there may be tax implications, there may be tax disadvantages, and so on. And so as well as just checking the validity and whether things are up to date or not, it's the recommendations that you guys come back with to say, well, okay, here are the areas that we really think you should pay attention, and you'd save some tax if you did this, and you know, you'd be advantaged in other ways if you set up your structure like this instead of the way you've currently got it. So
yeah,
that's a very valuable tool. Very important part of our process that we go through with clients is making sure that this happens so that you're building on strong foundations. Sue, I just want to, before Juanita and I finish off, any questions or comments you'd like to make? So you've been sitting there so dutifully.
Sorry, no, I don't think I've got any questions, but I've got a whole lot of things to go and have a think about and a look at. So that's been quite useful. So thank you very much. Yeah.
Okay, I'm glad today was valuable. Okay, well,
it goes to show, Mark, I think, you know, a lot of people say, why do I need a will, but why do I need estate planning? But you know, these are all the little tricks and the little sort of hurdles that you just don't know unless you're aware of them and you can, you know, get the appropriate advice.
Yeah, and a big shout out to Murdoch Lawyers, because this was a concept Tom and I talked about years ago, and you know, Tom put that into place, and you guys use that all the time now. And I'm just going to say, as a call out to you guys, that I haven't found any other lawyers that actually go to this level of detail to make sure all the structures are right before they start work. So you know, it's something that you guys do very well. So well
Thanks.
done. Anyway, and so that's it for today. And I'm going to have a talk to Anita and see if we make these weekly instead of fortnightly. So I'll let you think about that for a while first, Anita. And because I think they're valuable, and the feedback I've been getting has been it's been quite good in regard to what people are getting out of these. So Juanita, thanks for your time. Sue, thanks for joining us on board.
Good to see you again, Sue.
Yep. And to everyone else watching on the Facebook page, thanks for coming along today, and hope you found some real value in what we've been talking about. Thank you.